All right, well, good afternoon. This is Jay Waters. I'm with the Americans in Wartime Museum, and we're doing an oral history interview this afternoon. It's 23 October 2018. We're in the Fort Hunt neighborhood of Alexandria, and I've got the pleasure of interviewing my neighbor and friend, Mrs. Lorrie Rezendes. Lorrie, if you could just introduce yourself, where you were born, and when you were, your full name, and where you were born, and when you were born, please.
In Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. And I grew up in Pennsylvania and went to college in Pennsylvania. And then I taught school 1 year and then I joined the Navy.
And so what year did you actually join the Navy?
I actually joined in 1978, but our class numbers, I got my commission. I was the first class of 79001 because it was after October, and the military does their years a little different than civilians. It ends September 30th and starts 1 October.
Well, and I saw you've had a long Navy career, but specifically, did you participate in any armed conflicts?
I was in during Desert Storm. I was actually the commanding officer of the Poughkeepsie Reserve Center at that time. And it was very interesting because I was actually in school at Staten Island. I just reported in for my school and I got a call in the middle of the night saying that we were going to activate reservists. So I had to get up, and go back because we were activating them in the morning. And it was kind of a pretty exciting time, but it was also shocking in the fact that nothing went the way as we planned. We planned on activating like a whole unit at a time, and all they did was recall certain people and certain specialities that they wanted. So we picked people from different units in the specialities they wanted, and then we activated them. So they didn't go as a whole unit as we thought they would.
Okay. Well, and then we're going to back up a little bit. Did you have any family members, brothers, sisters, parents who were in the military?
Yes, my father served during World War II, and he was also in the Navy. He was a Seabee. And then my brother, he was in the Army. He was a paratrooper.
Okay.
And my sister was in the Air Force, and she was in charge of the gyms and welfare and rec.
For which service?
For the Air Force.
Okay.
Yes.
So you got the family covering pretty much all the branches of service at some point.
Right. We tried to get someone to join the Marines, but my nephew actually tried to, but he was physically unqualified because he had a flat foot.
So I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and this question's a little bit different, but think about September 11th, 2001. Where were you? What were you doing? And kind of what can you tell us about that day?
I was actually teaching school after I retired. I was a teacher of 4th grade, and we actually didn't know what was going on because we were in the classroom and we were told not to turn on the TV. So it wasn't till lunchtime that I went to the lunchroom and we actually saw on the news what was happening. We were told not to tell any of the children because we didn't know if any of their parents or relatives were stationed at the Pentagon. But the kids all knew something was up because parents started coming and taking their children out of school, and the kids, like I said, we just tried to remain calm, and then when I went home, the whole neighborhood was extremely quiet. I remember going for a walk with my husband, and it was like deathly quiet. And then I watched the news, and I found out further information. But the plane that hit the Pentagon was pretty close to where I worked at the Pentagon. And one of the admirals I worked for was on that plane, and he perished. His name was Admiral Flagg.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But yeah, so you were living right here in the neighborhood at
Right.
the time. What school were you teaching at?
I was teaching at Bellevue Elementary School.
Yeah, the school that my son went to. Yeah. So, okay, well, yeah, I mean, that was a tough day. So Lorrie, why did you join the Navy? What got you in?
I joined the Navy because I really am very patriotic. I did want to travel, and I also wanted to be around people my own age. I did teach for a year after college, but all the teachers were older, and like I said, I missed the camaraderie I had at college, and I just wanted to have that good camaraderie, which I did find in the Navy.
Okay, so then after you had joined, where did you go for your initial training?
I went to Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, and the school was 16 weeks long.
And what did you like or not like about that?
Well, actually, for me, it wasn't a big shock because I grew up in a big family and I was used to taking orders from my father, and I also played a lot of sports. But for a lot of people, it was, a big shocker. I was in the second class that was integrated with men, and there were 2 people per room, and the upperclassmen broke in the junior class coming in, and I remember 2 guys being right across from me, and when the upperclassmen, you always had to cage your eyes and look straight ahead, but when the MPs were up the other end, I tried to get him to laugh, and he would never laugh or smile or do anything because he was so scared of getting into trouble.
Right.
And my roommate wanted to sleep on the floor because they kept tearing our beds up because we didn't make them correctly. And I told her it was just a game and you had to go along. But some people took it so seriously, not that I didn't, but it was that they let it get to their nerves.
Right.
And the whole time going through the first week, it was called Hell Week. They said if you didn't make it through the maze, you would have another Hell Week. And all I know is the first week was so horrible because of the tasks they put us through, the long days that we all wanted to make it through the maze, but we didn't know what the maze was. And a lot of the people didn't make it through the maze. And
Well, so what was the maze?
the maze was you went to this big auditorium and they told you to take 3 steps forward. And, and then 3 people came up to you and were yelling at you at the same time. And you had to remember who has the con, because on a ship, that's the one giving the commands. And you had to answer the questions. And then when you were done with that station, they would tell you to take 3 steps to starboard and 2 to the port. And you would be at the next one. And you kept doing it till you got all the way to the end of the gym. But all I know is that we had a whole book that we had to memorize before the week was over. Of course, it was too much of a task, and I only had it half memorized. But one correct answer was, I do not know, sir, but I will find out. So one time they asked me the color of a red buoy, and it wasn't the color that, or it wasn't one of the questions I studied. So I said, I do not know, sir, but I will find out. And they started yelling at me. Then I realized what the question was. Again, it was just nerves. And then, of course, you couldn't laugh at this point ever when, the MPs were working with you. I just said the color of a red buoy is red, sir. And then, of course, they let me go to the next station, and I passed. But
I'm sorry. What year? And so, what year was this?
This was in. It was actually in. 1978.
Okay.
But I actually got to be an assistant company commander when I was at Officer Candidate School, so I got to participate in the maze when the next class came through, and I was shocked to see how many people passed out just from nerves. And again, they were trying to build confidence. They were trying to build a lot of things, and for some people, it was very hard. But I always had a lot of confidence, and like I said, for me, it wasn't hard, but for some people it was.
And so this was your OCS. Could you go for additional training after the OCS?
After that, I was selected to be a communication officer, so I went to a 4-week school to learn how to be a communication officer. I spent Christmas at home, and then in January, I reported to my first command.
And where was your first command?
It was in Honolulu, Hawaii. It was NAVCAM's EastPac, but it stands for Naval Communications Area Master Station, Eastern Pacific. And I actually reported into Camp Smith, and it was a joint command between Navy and Marines.
And so you were an ensign then, like a lieutenant?
I was an ensign.
Ensign,
Yeah, an ensign is a 01 in the Navy. And we worked shifts. I worked at 2 and 80. I worked 2 days, and then 2 nights, and then 2 evenings, and then I had 3 days off.
Okay.
And we pretty much just made sure all the commands in Hawaii got their communications, which was messages.
And so, did you have a rating, or the Army would call it an MOS, or were you called a communications officer? What was your like?
I was called a communication officer.
Okay. Well, where else did you serve besides Hawaii?
Well, actually in Hawaii, at the same command, I was a communication officer for 1 year, but I personally didn't like it that much, so I actually asked to be the human goals and training officer because education is my background. That's what my degree is in. And I also, when I was in Hawaii, I went back and got my master's in education. But at this position, I actually was helping develop a training program to help the enlisted people pass their examination so they could get promoted. And it was actually very worthwhile. The human goals part wasn't as fun because we dealt with people that had alcohol or drugs, and pretty much anybody that was doing drugs got kicked out immediately. But alcohol was a problem, and we tried to get them into, of course, a program that would help them. And I also ran the indoctrination for the command, telling them all the fun things to do in Hawaii so they would take the right path.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Fun things to do in Hawaii. Well, let's just talk about some. I see you've got a big list there, but some of your other assignments after Hawaii.
Well, after that, I went to recruiting, and the detailer asked me 3 times if I knew what I was getting myself into. And I guess no one asked to go to recruiting from what he said. But I went to recruiting, and at the same time, my husband got out of the Navy, and he wanted to go back and get his master's. I picked this big city near my hometown, which was Pittsburgh. My husband went to the University of Pittsburgh, and I thought I would be recruiting regular officers, but for some reason the commanding officer wanted me to be the nuclear officer recruiter, which was the hardest, beside doctors, positions to fill. At first I was a little intimidated going to talk to the top engineers at all the big universities, but I found out that they were just human, just like you and I, and they asked normal questions. They didn't ask me how a nuclear reactor worked or anything like that. And I was actually very successful at that job. I was actually nominated the best nuclear recruiter in the nation, and I spoke at several conferences when I was stationed at that command. So It worked out very well for me.
So you liked that assignment?
I liked that assignment very much.
Okay. Well, then where'd you go after Pittsburgh?
Well, that is the funniest part of my story, I think, is this is the first time I ever went to get counseled. So I came down to D.C. To see if my career was on track. And he told me that I was way behind the power curve because I was a nuclear recruiter for 4 years and I brought in a lot of points for my team. But my commanding officer would not let me be the department head, so I did not have a department head tour, and I was going up for promotion. So I asked the detailer what jobs I could have, and I was still not offered a good position. So by chance, I just called up the reserve world, and they said they would love to have me, and I could be an executive officer. And so at that time, I gave up my USN commission, and I became USNR, and I became a TAR officer, which means Training and Administration of Reserves. And I was the executive officer at the Pittsburgh Reserve Center. And then when the commanding officer retired, I said that I loved it so much that I would stay there and be the commanding officer. And initially they said yes. And I was the commanding officer for about 6 months, but I was a 04 and it was a 06 billet.
Oh, wow.
And as soon as they found someone that wanted to come to Pittsburgh, they told me that I had to leave, but they promised me another commanding officer tour, but of a smaller center. Pittsburgh was very, very large. It was considered a large reserve center, over 1,200 people. And then I went to Poughkeepsie Reserve Center, which had 600 reservists, and I was the commanding officer there. and my career just took off since I made that switch from, USN to USNR, and the TAR community and working with the reserves was the best thing I ever decided to do. And it fit my background as well.
Well, and I know we mentioned briefly the Desert Storm when you were up at the, I think it was the Arsenal.
Well, Poughkeepsie Reserve Center.
Okay. So did you have any other time where you were on like an operational deployment or a combat related deployment or anything?
No.
Okay, but then let's talk more about the Poughkeepsie. So did you actually send reservists and mobilize reservists out of your station there?
Right. We only sent about 50, and we sent the people that they needed. And like I said, sometimes it was in groups or 1 or 5 or 10, and again, they just went to the command that they were training to go to, and they filled in as people deployed to go to hot spots. And everybody at my center, we had no problems whatsoever. We did do our homework, and we made sure that when they signed up, they were not conscientious objectors or anything like that. But other reserve centers did have problems in the fact that some people didn't want to be, recalled. But again, that's the job of a reservist. And when they enter the reserve center, we make sure they fill out all the forms and they know that it is a possibility of being recalled.
So it sounds like this was a mission that you didn't necessarily see coming, but you had done some good preparation, and then when the mobilization started to occur, you were ready.
Right.
Okay. No, that's good. That's good. Well, let's just go. Did you ever spend times on the ship?
I spent a week away on a carrier just to see how it was. But when
how was it?
It was fine and it was fun. But when I joined the Navy, women were not allowed on ships. And after 2 years in the Navy, they did change it. And I thought about going on a ship, but my husband was on a ship, and we already didn't see each other very much, so he did not want me to change my designator. So I stayed, the one that I was. And again, the women that did change to go on the ships, I have a couple friends, they did have a hard time because they weren't very well, recepted, because it was a man's world and they weren't used to having women around.
Yeah, and I guess you mentioned too about being the second integrated class up in Newport, and then a couple of different. Anything else you wanted to mention about that, or just the women's integration that you were a large part of?
Like I said, I love the jobs I had and the people I worked with, but it was hard on the women in the fact that my designation, you didn't get a warfare pin. And so we went up, I was on the surface warfare side, and we went up with all the men. And 50% or more of the women got passed over, and they were asked to leave the service because, again, they didn't have jobs that equated to the man's responsibility. So, again, the women got passed over. And that's why one of my best friends wanted to go on a ship, because she wanted to be just as competitive as the men. And by going on a ship, like I said, she had other problems than I did. Once I switched to the working with the reserves, I had no problems with any promotion. In fact, I went from the bottom of the heap to the top of the heap, and they didn't look at that at all. And they had their own promotion boards. And like I said, on one of my fit reps, the admiral wrote I had everything it took to be an admiral. Again, they appreciated good leadership, and you didn't have to have a warfare pin to have a good position.
Well, and looking at your sheet here, you got promoted a bunch of times. It looked like your highest rank was 05 Navy Commander. Which promotion was maybe the most meaningful, or anything stand out for your promotion ceremonies or things like that?
I think when I was stationed at the Pentagon and I made 05 or commander, that's a senior officer, so you get your scrambled eggs on your hat. So it was kind of like a big thing for me, because when you come in, you were at awe of all the senior officers, and all of a sudden you are one. And I was also at a very prestigious office at that time. I worked for the Assistant Secretary of Defense of Reserve Affairs, And if you're really important, you get an office on the E-ring where you have windows. And I had the promotion ceremony in her office, and my husband and children came down, and it was very, very nice.
Cool. No, good for you. That's outstanding. That's outstanding. What do you think was your favorite assignment, and why, of course?
I would probably say the Pentagon because, again, I listen to my heart and not to other people. The office I worked for the Assistant Secretary of Defense, had 3 jobs: readiness, mobilization, and training. And readiness is the one that everybody wanted to work in because it had high visibility. But I picked my passion, which was training, even though I was asked to join the readiness team, and everybody thought I was crazy for staying with training. But I love training. I love what I do. And I was the only 05 that was in charge of a project. Everybody else that had a project of their own was a 06. And so I felt really great about my project. And I started it from scratch. They asked me to think of what needed to be done and to do it. And I wanted all the services to work together, and reserves and active duty coming up with common training that we could do together to save money, and also starting in on the computer training and the also distance learning training, because it's hard to provide great training at the Reserve Center if you do not live by a base. And so computer training and distant learning training is the way to go. And a lot of the general military training you could do this way. So again, I started the program. I got the active duty people on board. I think it helped that I had 10 years on the active side, because no one thought I would be able to get the active side to work with the reserves. There was a competition between us. And when I left, they had to replace me with a 06. I was in a 05 billet, and they upgraded it to a 06 billet.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, so I understand that your husband, Steve, another friend and neighbor of ours here, was in the Navy as well. And did you meet him while you were both in the Navy, or can you tell us a little bit about that?
I did meet him at Officer Candidate School, and he was the class behind me. And he was having a really rough time when I told you about Hell Week. He did not like it. He didn't like how he was treated. He actually was homesick, and he was thinking about quitting. And I actually gave him the pep talk. And I also, it happened to be his birthday, so I bought a cake, and I had the whole company come down and sing happy birthday to him. So he decided to stick around, and we eventually started dating. And I think he was glad that he did 4 years. He didn't want to make it a career because he grew up without a father, and he did not want our kids not to have him around, but he was deployed a lot, and we had a lot of separations.
Yeah. Well, we'll try to get Steve in here one of these days for an interview too. So in fact, on that, were you ever separated from the family during your career?
I didn't. Oh, no. I had all shore duty, so I was never separated for my kids, except I did run a lot of conferences, so I would be gone usually 3 days to a week. And then my trainings were usually in between duty stations, and usually they were short in nature. Beside the first one, I went communication, but almost all my other schools were 1 or 2 weeks.
Yeah. Did you have any schools during your Navy time, besides the ones we already talked about, that stood out, or were something unique or special that you did?
Well, the commanding officer school, it was just unique in the fact it was in New Orleans, which is a great place to have a school.
Sure.
But I was pregnant at the time, and so everybody came in to see who the pregnant commanding officer was, because most people have their children earlier and before they have command. So a lot of people were talking about me. And
about you specifically?
Yes, and
Wow.
they wanted to see who I was, and they thought I used bad judgment. But again, this was my second reserve center, and it was the only job I ever had that was the same twice in a row. I was the XO, and now I was going to be the commanding officer. I was very confident, And Admiral Flagg, when I got my fit rep, he told me that when he met me, he was a little leery, but that I was the biggest delight that he ever had because I knew what I was doing, and my reserve center was top rate. We actually won the award for the best middle-sized reserve center in the nation. So, yeah, we were, like I said, I was very pleased with the people that worked for me and what we were able to accomplish.
Well, and I think at the end of the day, maybe you fit the expression, the results speak for themselves. If you're getting outstanding results, that's what it's all about.
Right, and I believe just treating people like you like to be treated is the way to go. And one of my best friends went to the Bronx, and I went to Poughkeepsie, and both of our reserve centers had a lot of things that needed to be fixed, but he put everybody on mandatory hours, and they hated him immediately. And I told everybody when they were inspection ready, they could have a half a day off every week because this was their shore duty. And when they go to sea, they work extremely hard. And so they worked for me. And like I said, we fell into a pace. And I also said if they got outstanding on the inspection, they would receive a Navy Achievement Medal. And so I used just positive reinforcements instead of negative. And therefore, I think that's one of the reasons I got results.
No, I agree. Well, and you mentioned a couple of the senior personnel that you worked for, but did you have any either junior officers or junior chiefs or petty officers, enlisted personnel that really stand out for you?
I would say, yes, Chief Royer at Poughkeepsie, when I went there, the commanding officer before me got relieved for cause for drugs, and he was at Fort Leavenworth. And so things were not very tight. And in the absence, my chief had to be the executive officer. And when I got there, I didn't want to make a million changes right at once. I wanted to, get the lay of the land and everything. But unfortunately, my supply clerk told me that there was money being misused from the officers' mess, and I had to call my boss and inform them that I just found out, and I stopped it. And anyways, there was a big investigation. They read me my rights and everything, but it was a 06 that said that it was okay to take the money and put it into welfare and rec. But it was for their parties, but it was supposed to be going back into the Navy. And he in the investigation, they said that it went through, that he okayed it through my chief. But lots of times enlisted personnel, they do not know how the officer side works. They're just very familiar with the enlisted side, and the enlisted side, they do get free lunches, but the officers have to pay for it, and then it goes back into the government. And when the results came out, I disagreed with the results because they wanted to ruin my chief's career. I went to the admiral. I fought for my chief to get it taken out, that nothing would happen to his career. I believe the 06 was fully responsible and knew that I would not approve of it, and that's why he went to the executive officer. But I did take the executive officer title from my chief, and I told him that he was the training department head. So he actually did not talk to me for, I would say, 6 months, except for business. But when he came in to get his evaluation, he was actually physically shaking. And when he found out that I gave him nothing but the highest marks, because again, I graded him on his performance, not the fact that he didn't like me. And after that, we actually became best friends, and he saw that I knew what I was doing and how the Reserve Center turned around. And, so we remained very close.
Yeah. So, and he continued on with his Navy
Right.
career as well. No,
Yes.
That's great. That's great. That's a good story. I saw on your information sheet here you received quite a few medals and service awards. Could you just talk a little bit about those?
Yes, I think the Navy doesn't give out as many awards as other services, but I got my first one when I was recruiting for, again, being the best recruiter in the nation. And then every command after that, I got one when I left because of my superior work. I got another Navy Achievement Medal for being the executive officer of the Pittsburgh Reserve Center, and then I got a Navy commendation after being the commanding officer of the Poughkeepsie Reserve Center. And then I got another Navy commendation after I worked for the Assistant Secretary of Reserve Affairs at the Pentagon. And then my last tour was at Indian Head, Maryland, which was very interesting because I knew nothing about ordnance. And it was the Naval Ordnance Center, and I was sent there to write the training curriculum and the administration rules because the reserve were not well received. The program was not well run. So I did that job, and I got a Meritorious Service Medal, which was very high. And that was after that tour, I retired because my family did not want to move around anymore. And my son got accepted at a very prestigious school, Thomas Jefferson, and my husband got a job that he really liked.
Well, that's important. And you still had, looking at the dates here, well over 20 years of combined service, though, right?
Right.
Yeah. So
It was actually 21 years because they counted the time you were at officer candidate school, even though I wasn't an officer, but they counted that time.
so did you have a retirement ceremony?
I had a retirement ceremony.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was very nice. My husband got me flowers, and they made me a shadow box with all, my ranks in it and the flag, and people gave nice speeches. And I got to invite my friends from the Pentagon as well as the people from the Naval Ordnance Center, and my family came, and it was just a very nice way to end a career and say goodbye to people that really meant a lot to you.
No, that's important. That's important. Well, we're kind of winding down on the questions, but we talked a little bit too about how women into the Navy, and you were in there during some key years. What would you say, though, looking at the Navy now versus when you started out, how women have come along and are, from my perspective, probably pretty much equals? But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think almost all the areas are open to women, and so they are able to get warfare pins in every area. And so I think for them, they see everything as equal. I have spoke to several of them, and they can't believe what we had to go through to see what they're able to do now. But it's very refreshing. And it's refreshing when I teach school because I tell the girls they could do anything, and I do believe it. I believe they could have any job they want, and nothing can stand in their way. And when I went to college, pretty much they tried to talk you into either being a teacher or a nurse. And now, women, they could be engineers, they could do anything they want, doctors, lawyers, and I don't think any girl thinks like I did when I was growing up, or, because there's just so many more opportunities.
Well, and the next question, you almost kind of answered it by the other way around, but how do you think your Navy experience affected the rest of your life after the Navy?
I think it affected me in the fact that it gave me even more confidence than I had, because one job we never talked about was 3rd Fleet, but when I worked at the Commander 3rd Fleet, I was a special projects officer in charge of Koalave, and the first day he told me to read this. It was like 5-inch binder. It was an environmental impact statement. He told me to read it and come up with all the jobs that needed to be done. And I'm thinking, I think you have the wrong person. But actually, I did write down all the projects that needed to be done. And when I went in to talk to my boss, who was a 06 or a captain, he did tell me how to proceed, because we had to plant trees, and I had no idea which trees would grow in that environment. So I worked with the Department of Forestry in Hawaii, and then we had to clean unexploded ordnance off the sections of the island. And again, I worked with so many expertise where we formulated plans together. It wasn't like I was doing everything. I was just in charge of all the projects. And the island closed down 10 days every month so we could do our projects. And we still remain, when I was there, it was a training grounds, and we used the other sections for training, but we were cleaning it up in the hopes of giving it back to the Hawaiian people, which we have done since I left.
Okay.
And that was a very, like I said, to me, a very rewarding job. And I didn't think I could do it, but I had a lot of fun doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, yeah, and was there any other assignment that we didn't talk about that you wanted to tell us about?
Well, no, I think that's pretty much it. But like I said, I did love every job that I had, and I loved going to work, and I was proud of the uniform.
All right, there's two questions left. So, looking back on everything that you've done, is there one thing that you would like your kids, your grandkids, and future generations to know about you and your naval service? What would you tell them?
I would tell them that the service isn't for everybody, but if you love if you love serving your country and being put in jobs that are hard, you will find it challenging. And again, if you're not afraid of separations, again, I didn't have to go through the separations, but it's a great career. And I do believe, even if you do not pick it for a career, that everybody would be better if they went in for at least 4 years. My husband used to come recruiting with me, even though he got out. And he talked about how much he grew, even though he only stayed in for 4 years. But again, how much of a better person he was and how much he learned. And it is a good experience.
Oh, I agree. I agree. Then the last question is the open-ended. Is there anything else that you would like to have included in this interview?
I can't think of anything right now.
Okay. Well, on behalf of Lorrie, on behalf of our museum, I'd like to present this small token of our appreciation. I'm sure you're familiar with the challenge coins.
Wow.
But those are the coins we give out on behalf of the Oral History Project and the Americans in Wartime Museum. And maybe just hold it up.
Yep, very, very nice.
And while we're still on camera, I'd just again like to say thanks for
All right. You're
the
welcome.
opportunity to do this.